They fired me at 4:52 p.m. on a Thursday and thought the story ended there. They were wrong. I remember the exact second because the clock on the glass wall behind the HR director kept ticking louder with every word she spoke, as if time itself was counting down to a mistake they didn't realize they were making. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, listening as my career was summarized in 3 cold sentences: organizational misalignment, leadership concerns, performance shortfalls. No examples, no warnings. Just conclusions. I nodded. I didn't argue. That alone unsettled them. My name is Elena Ward, and until that moment, I was the director of risk strategy at North Shore Analytics, a financial compliance firm that advised multinational banks on how to avoid catastrophic regulatory failures. Ironically, my job had always been about spotting what others overlooked. Patterns, missing documents, silent risks hiding in plain sight. So when they slid the termination packet across the table and told me I had 30 minutes to sign if I wanted severance, I didn't panic. I read, page by page, line by line. The severance looked standard: 12 weeks pay, health coverage extension, confidentiality clauses, a non-disparagement agreement written aggressively enough to scare most people into silence. They watched me the way people watch a ticking bomb, assuming pressure would make me rush. But pressure sharpens me. What caught my attention wasn't what they'd written. It was what they hadn't. The termination was explicitly labeled performance-based. That mattered. Because buried deep inside North Shore's internal governance framework, a framework I had personally helped revise 2 years earlier, was a clause that required documented performance remediation for any termination labeled that way. Written warnings, improvement plans, formal evaluations, attachments. There were none, not a single appendix. Not one documented warning. No evidence. Just accusations floating in the air like smoke with no fire. I signed anyway. Every page. Every initial. Calmly. Carefully. I thanked them, stood up, collected my bag, and walked out without looking back. They thought compliance meant submission. They didn't understand the difference. At 2:06 a.m., my phone rang. A known number. New York area code. Legal department. The voice on the other end was strained, professional, and trembling just enough to tell me everything. Elena, this is corporate counsel. We need to ask you something urgently. Please tell me you haven't signed the documents yet. I smiled in the dark of my apartment and asked a single question back. Which documents? The ones missing the required attachments. Silence, and that's when I knew this wasn't over. This was just beginning. But what they did next was the mistake that exposed everything. The silence on the line stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. I could hear faint voices in the background, muffled, urgent, overlapping. This wasn't a casual follow-up. It was damage control. Elena, the lawyer finally said, choosing his words carefully now, there appears to have been a procedural oversight in the termination materials you received. An oversight. I spent my career watching corporations bury disasters under softer language. Oversight, miscommunication, administrative error. Words designed to make negligence sound harmless. I executed the agreement exactly as presented, I replied evenly. Every page, every signature line. Are you suggesting your firm issued incomplete legal documentation? He didn't answer directly. That told me enough. What they didn't know was that North Shore's compliance protocols weren't theoretical to me. I had enforced them against banks that thought they were untouchable. I'd watched executives lose licenses, careers, and reputations because someone assumed no one would read the fine print. And now they were hoping I hadn't. We'd like to provide you with revised documents, he continued, voice tight. For clarity. Clarity requires facts, I said. And facts require attachments. Which I did not receive. Another pause. Longer this time. Elena, the termination classification may need reconsideration. There it was, the crack. If it wasn't performance-based, then the termination letter was false. If it was performance-based, then the agreement violated their own governance rules. Either way, they had a problem. I ended the call politely and didn't sleep at all. By morning, my inbox was full. A formal request to meet and resolve matters amicably, a calendar invite marked urgent. Language dripping with cooperation that hadn't existed 12 hours earlier. I forwarded everything to Rachel Klein, an employment litigator I'd once recommended to a former colleague. When she called me back, her voice was sharp with interest. They're panicking, she said. They terminated you without procedural backing and realized too late who they were dealing with. At the meeting, they arrived with reinforcements, outside counsel. A finance executive. Faces I'd never seen before, but recognized instantly as the people who show up when money is at risk. They slid a new packet toward me. This includes documentation that should have accompanied the original agreement, one of them said carefully. Should have, I read it slowly. Statements from managers who'd never criticized me before. Vague accusations with no dates, no metrics, no measurable failures. One document referenced a restructuring phase that occurred after my termination. They had written the story backwards. This is retroactive, Rachel said calmly. And that's not correction. That's fabrication. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. That's when they made their first offer. More money, extended benefits, absolute silence. They weren't trying to fix a mistake anymore. They were trying to bury evidence. And what they didn't realize was that this meeting, this exact moment, was when the story stopped being about me, because if they'd done this to me, how many others had they silenced the same way? And what would happen if the pattern became public? Once you suspect a pattern, you can't unsee it. Rachel didn't start with lawsuits. She started with questions, quiet ones, the kind that don't leave fingerprints. Former employees, industry contacts, compliance filings, LinkedIn profiles that suddenly made sense when viewed together instead of alone. Within days, the coincidences stacked too neatly. Senior analysts dismissed for alignment issues. Compliance leads terminated for communication problems. Risk managers let go during strategic shifts. Different words, same outcome. Same silence. Every termination happened within months of a leadership change. Every file lacked formal remediation records. And every employee had accepted severance quickly, not because they were guilty, but because they were exhausted, afraid, or unaware of what had been skipped. I wasn't special. I was just the first one who read everything. Rachel compiled timelines while I revisited my final weeks at North Shore, the subtle isolation. Meetings I was suddenly excluded from, decisions reversed without explanation. Feedback that existed only verbally, never in writing. I had felt the shift but dismissed it as politics. It wasn't politics. It was preparation. The deeper Rachel dug, the uglier it became. Internal restructuring plans framed as efficiency optimization. Budget targets tied directly to removing higher compensated long-tenure staff. Performance labels applied after decisions were already made. Then came the document that changed everything. An internal strategy memo surfaced from a former finance controller who left quietly 6 months earlier. It wasn't addressed to me, but my role was highlighted. Salary, influence, risk of resistance, and one line that made my stomach turn. Performance classification offers fastest exit with minimal exposure, unless someone fought back. Rachel leaned back in her chair when she finished reading. This isn't just wrongful termination, she said. This is systematic misclassification. If this goes public, it doesn't stop at one case. We filed, not quietly, not quickly. The complaint wasn't just about my termination. It outlined a corporate method. A cost reduction strategy disguised as performance management. A pattern that regulators would understand instantly. North Shore responded the way corporations always do at first, denial wrapped in confidence. A motion to dismiss. A claim that I signed away my rights. But something had changed. Because now, discovery wasn't theoretical. Discovery meant emails, calendars, drafts that were never meant to be read out loud. And the judge saw it too. When North Shore's counsel tried to explain why required documentation wasn't attached but existed in principle, the courtroom went still. Policies exist to be followed, the judge said flatly. Not retroactively justified. That ruling cracked the foundation. From that moment on, the case wasn't about whether I'd been underperforming. It was about what North Shore was hiding. And suddenly people started reaching out. Former employees, quiet messages, shared experiences. Identical phrases from different years. The pattern had found its voice. And North Shore was about to learn what happens when silence breaks all at once, because the evidence they never thought anyone would connect was about to become impossible to ignore. Discovery doesn't knock. It breaks the door down. Once the judge denied North Shore's attempt to dismiss the case, their entire internal world became fair game. Emails, drafts, internal chats, budget forecasts, the unfiltered version of a company that had spent years polishing its public image. Rachel warned me before the first batch arrived. Some of this is going to be ugly, she was right. At first, the emails were cautious. Executives using careful language, talking around decisions instead of naming them. But the deeper we went, the sloppier it became. Threats forwarded too many times. Side comments that assumed no outsider would ever read them. Then we found the chain. It started 3 weeks before my termination. The subject line was harmless enough, Q3 cost alignment update, but buried in the replies was the truth they'd been avoiding. Targets were listed, budget gaps, pressure from investors, and beneath it all, a short message from a senior executive that made my hands go cold. High salary compliance roles are limiting flexibility. Recommend performance-based exits to accelerate reductions. Performance-based exits. Not because of failures, because of speed. Another executive responded with hesitation, mentioning internal requirements, documentation, remediation timelines, risks. The reply came minutes later. We don't have time for formal improvement cycles. Keep it tight. That was it. The moment intent became undeniable. They hadn't forgotten policy. They had chosen to bypass it. Worse, in another message, my name appeared again, not as an employee. As a line item, Ward may challenge. Ensure paperwork discourages pushback. I stared at the screen, feeling something colder than anger settle in my chest. I'd advised financial institutions on how small compliance shortcuts could become billion-dollar disasters. And here they were, doing exactly what I'd warned others against. Rachel didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. This moves us into exposure territory, she said quietly. Not just for damages, for regulators. For their board, North Shore realized it too. The tone of their communication shifted overnight. Settlement interest. Requests for private resolution. Offers that climbed rapidly and quietly. They wanted silence more than savings now, but the emails didn't stop there. We found templates, pre-written termination language. Reusable phrases designed to sound specific while saying nothing. It wasn't just me, it was a system. And systems collapse when exposed. When Rachel submitted the email chain as an exhibit, North Shore's legal team tried to seal it. Claimed confidentiality. Claimed misinterpretation. The judge disagreed. These communications speak for themselves, she said. From that moment on, North Shore wasn't defending a decision anymore. They were defending a culture, and cultures don't survive daylight. Because once those emails became part of the public record, the fallout was no longer something money could quietly erase. The moment the filings became public, everything changed. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was suddenly searchable. Journalists didn't need leaks or anonymous tips. The evidence was sitting inside court records, stamped and verified. All they had to do was read, and they did. The first article framed it cautiously. Former executive alleges systematic misclassification at North Shore Analytics. By the end of the week, the tone shifted. Headlines grew sharper. Questions louder. Internal emails suggest cost-cutting firings disguised as performance issues. North Shore issued a statement within hours. Carefully worded, firm denial, absolute confidence in their processes. But statements don't erase documents, and documents don't forget. Former employees began speaking publicly, some anonymously, others openly, tired of pretending nothing had happened. Stories aligned too perfectly to dismiss. The same phrases, the same timing, the same absence of warnings. Investors noticed. So did regulators. The board announced an internal review. Then a third-party audit. Then, quietly, the resignation of 2 senior executives to pursue other opportunities. The language was familiar, polite, vague. I recognized it immediately. They were using their own playbook. Rachel's phone didn't stop ringing. Media requests, legal inquiries, former employees asking if they had options. If what happened to them mattered. It did. North Shore settlement offers doubled, then tripled. Always with the same condition, confidentiality, silence, no admission of wrongdoing. I refused. Not because I wanted revenge, but because silence was the disease that allowed this to happen in the first place. When we finally settled, the terms were different. No secrecy. No buried clauses. A public acknowledgement that termination procedures had not been followed. A commitment to review past cases. Compensation not just for me, but a remediation fund for others affected. The day the settlement was announced, North Shore stock dipped sharply. Analysts cited governance concerns. Clients quietly reconsidered contracts. Compliance, the very thing they tried to shortcut, became their greatest liability. And then the final call came. A board member I'd never met asked to speak with me privately. You forced a reckoning, he said. Not just legally, culturally. I hung up and sat in silence for a long time afterward, not triumphant, not relieved. Just aware of how close this had come to disappearing without a trace. If I signed faster. If I'd been too tired to read. If I'd chosen silence over scrutiny, the exposure didn't just cost them money. It cost them trust. And trust, once broken in public, never fully returns. But the most surprising consequence of all came months later from someone I never expected to hear from. The call came months after the headlines faded. No urgency, no legal tension, just a calm voice asking if I had a moment. He introduced himself as a former board advisor to North Shore, someone who has stepped away quietly during the chaos. "I thought you should know what happened after you left," he said. What followed wasn't dramatic. It was worse, methodical. The third-party audit uncovered dozens of improperly classified terminations. Performance labels used where none applied. Documentation created after decisions were already made. Entire teams reshaped through fear and ambiguity instead of transparency. 17 former employees were formally identified as having been terminated in violation of internal governance standards. 17. A remediation fund was established. Policies rewritten, mandatory executive training imposed. And the architect of the strategy, the executive who'd pushed for fast exits, was removed quietly, without ceremony, without praise. The irony wasn't lost on me. He exited the same way others had. I thanked the caller and ended the conversation. There was nothing more to say. In the months that followed, I didn't rush back into corporate life. I consulted. I spoke publicly. I taught companies how compliance failures don't start with malice, they start with shortcuts. Every presentation ended the same way. If your policy requires documentation, create it before you act. If you can't, ask yourself why. People listen differently when a lesson came with consequences. What stayed with me wasn't the settlement or the attention. It was the realization of how easily careers vanish when no one checks the process. How many people believe authority automatically equals correctness? North Shore believed that too. They assumed fear would make me compliant. That urgency would make me careless. That silence was inevitable. They never considered the possibility that the woman they fired understood their system better than they did. That I helped build it. The truth is, this story was never about revenge. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. Because systems don't change when people comply. They change when someone stops and asks a question no one wants to answer. And all it took was one missing document. So if you ever find yourself in a room where your future is being decided in a rush, pause, read everything, and ask yourself this: what are they hoping you won't notice?